let me go to Facebook Live real quick.
And Facebook Live is where we'll get a lot of the questions after we're done.
Okay.
And I will field those.
Hold on one second.
Technology is great until it's like screws up, right?
Okay. I'm going to try something. I'm going to try clicking my video icon on my camera. Maybe that'll free it up. Or maybe, maybe it'll screw it up.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We still see you.
Good. Okay. Well, that's positive.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to click start video on yours. Nope, nada.
Okay, I think we're live on Facebook on live stream. On Facebook, can everybody hear me okay? Rich?
I can hear you.
My name's Brian. I'm with the Cuban Genealogy Podcast and with Digital Cuba, along with co-founder Richard Dennis Carr. Our project, our passion project is to digitize parish records in Cuba. We will be doing that for many years to come. Rich Dennis Carr is you can correct me if I'm wrong, a PhD candidate at FIU.
Yes.
And we live and breathe Cuba 7 days a week, during our waking hours. So thank you, Richard Dennis. I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Brian. Welcome everybody to today's broadcast here at Digital Cuba. Like Brian said, this is also going to be available on the Cuban Genealogy Podcast. And one of our objectives, in addition to digitizing these parish records, can we ask people to mute themselves? Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah. If everybody could just mute themselves,
perfect.
That would be awesome. So one of the other things that we're trying to do here at Digital Cuba, and we're going to start up our digitization efforts again very soon, since they're letting people into Cuba. So we're very excited about that. Like I've mentioned in previous recordings, we have a lot of parishes that are interested in us going in and digitizing the records. So that's great. But we also want to provide more detailed histories of Cuba, where we focus, like we're doing today, on a specific time period or a topic. Kind of helps build our knowledge on the island's history, which can provide very important historical context when looking at our own family histories. These stories can really help color and bring to life the words on the documents that we're all very fond of collecting and trying to decipher and figure out what they mean. So today I'm very pleased to announce that we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Sherry Johnson. She is a professor emeritus of history at Florida International University, also a mentor of mine and a former professor. She's written two very important books, the first of which was The Groundbreaking Social Transformation of 18th Century Cuba. And it's celebrating its 20th anniversary of its publication this month. And in this book, Dr. Johnson reinterprets Cuban history of the 18th century by challenging the idea that sugar was everything, right? We always hear sugar, sugar, sugar. And she focuses on the importance of military reforms that not only make Cuba a demographic outlier in Spanish America, and that the island is basically the recipient of waves of military men coming in from Spain, but also produces rivalries between families and factions like the Galvez, Las Casas, Montalvos, and this is going to impact the island's destiny in the 19th century. The other book that we're going to be talking about is Climate and Catastrophe in Cuba and the Atlantic World in the Age of Revolution, a book that is celebrating its 10th anniversary. And it also won the 2012 Gordon Kaye and Sybil Lewis Prize for Caribbean Studies. In this book, Dr. Johnson draws on historical climatology, environmental history, and Cuban and American colonial history. And she kind of integrates the region's experience with extreme weather events like hurricanes and droughts. Very, very fascinating book. And she kind of weaves this into the history of Cuba, the Spanish Caribbean, and the Atlantic world. Welcome, Dr. Johnson. I affectionately call her Dr. J. Welcome to our discussion. We're really thrilled and honored to have you here with us today to discuss your work, which is so important. And by the way, the books are available, readily available if you want to purchase them. I think Social Transformation you can find on upf.com, which is University Press of Florida. In Climate and Catastrophe, you can find it at uncpress.org. We can also post those links. They're also available on Amazon, but Amazon's weird. It can have maybe a really, really high price. Like sometimes I've seen them for like $350 or something. So you don't have to do that. If there's a cheaper one there, that's great. But these sites, I think it's a pretty good, I think one is $24.99. The other one is maybe $34.99 or something. So they're pretty decently priced. Social Transformation of 18th Century Cuba. Dr. Johnson, what is the social transformation that you talk about, and what is this about? These military reforms, like how and why do they come about, and why does it make Cuba that outlier in Spanish America?
Well, first of all, let me thank you and Brian and Digital Cuba for inviting me today. I'm very, very pleased and honored to be here and to share my research with your audience. I'm an academic, and normally my audience doesn't reach the academic world. So this is a real honor and a real treat for me. Social transformation, the social transformation of Cuba refers to my idea that, as you mentioned, sugar is not everything. I think demographics, that is the arrival of a lot of other people into the island of Cuba, played a far more important part. Why is this? Because the demographic change affected much more people than sugar cultivation did. This concept began with my work on St. Augustine, in which I saw this pattern beginning in St. Augustine, in which there are all kinds of Spanish soldiers in the town affecting the lives of the people in St. Augustine. And it was just natural to extrapolate this to Cuba and ask the same questions that I was asking of St. Augustine. And that is, are people, because to get to St. Augustine, you had to go through Cuba in the 18th century. And so the question that I began with, the primary research question is, are large numbers coming into Cuba and subsequently going to Augustine, and they're coming to Cuba, how are they coming? Are they by military or the bureaucracy? Most importantly, if they're coming, are they having any demographic, is in a family history sense, effect on the population of Cuba? And that's where I began my questioning and my research. My first trip to Cuba to was in 1992, in summer of 1992. So essentially, that's what the book is about, and the conclusions that I found.
I just think, Dr. Johnson, if you don't mind, can you repeat what your conclusion was? Because while you were saying it, right at the meat of the best part, the audio was a little bit iffy. Can you kind of repeat what you just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I found was, beginning with my clues in St. Augustine, that this phenomenon, this demographic wave, if you will, was happening in St. Augustine. I took the questions to Cuba to inquire in the parish records in 1992. And I found that essentially the same thing is happening, but on a much larger scale, that waves and waves of peninsular immigration of men are coming into Cuba beginning in 1965 and continuing throughout the second half of the 18th century. This had an enormous impact on the demographic profile of Cuba, but especially on the people who are already living in Cuba and the receiving population of this wave of immigration.
Right. And so these connections, I think, are fascinating. And your book, you know, makes these arguments, but it does so in such a wonderful, descriptive way that I think is really one of the highlights of your work, is that you do really take the time to bring the reader to this time period in Cuba, and it almost feels like you're there riding on the carriage. One of the characters that you use is Bartolomé de Morales, and his arrival. He is one of the Spanish military men who arrives into Havana, and you describe his journey so beautifully that it really brings it to life. So I think that really makes your work, which is obviously, you know, researched meticulously, and I want to definitely talk about that, because I think that that's something that is very interesting. I wasn't aware of a lot of these records and how available they are to us as well. But you interweave that research with these beautiful descriptions. Bartolomé de Morales, he is Felix Varela's grandfather, correct? I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, yeah. So you make these wonderful connections between kind of this phenomenon that happens in the 18th century, and then also with what we're going to see happen in the 19th century. And you use records like censuses and parish records. You were in there doing research in parish archives in the 90s, right? During the special period.
Yes. 1992.
Wow. What was that like? Like, what did you find? Like, what was your experience looking at these archives and these records?
Well, to begin, I cannot say enough about the graciousness and the warm reception with which I was received in Havana, even during el periodo especial. Every archive that I went in, the archivist and the priest who was there were very, very welcoming. They understood that my research was purely academic. I had no. I found the archives to be in varying states of disarray, if you will, or in some cases in very good condition. And I was able to capture, at that point in time, between that trip and I went back in 1993, I was able to take down notes. There was no such thing as photocopying or digitization at the time. I was able to take down information on 4,400 marriages in Havana from the period 1765 through 1800. And it's through these marriages. First of all, let me qualify this. This was the marriages of Españoles. They were taken from the four major parishes in Havana, which would be termed Havana Intramuros, which was inside the walls. And they were, the primary parish was Catedral, Santo Angel, Santo Cristo del Buen Viaje, and Espiritu Santo in the southern end of town. And the reason why besides time constraints and demographic transportation constraints in 1992, those were parishes where the Españoles would settle. And so I don't need to belabor the fact that it was difficult to exist during the periodo especial, but for any inconvenience I suffered, the Cuban people suffered 1,000 times more. So it was not the easiest working conditions, and things got better as time went on. But like I say, I'm just extremely indebted and grateful to the people in Cuba for allowing me in and helping me as much as they did. And to come back with 4,400, the data on 4,400 marriages is quite significant.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine without a phone how, you know, how you would
It was done
begin
the
to
old
do that.
fashioned way with a
I wouldn't have
notebook
the
and
patience.
a pencil.
Yeah, yeah. So
Before, Rich, before you were a student, that's how we did notes.
yeah. Um, but so these marriages, because that's fascinating, right? So there's 4,400 marriages between 1765-ish or
In
1753, I
1800.
think. Yeah,
Yeah,
to
well,
1800.
I get them a little bit earlier. The earliest was 1756.
Yeah,
Marriage book was better, and that was in Catedral. And
yeah.
so it was better preserved, I guess is the word, than for example, Espiritu Santo's books are not as well preserved as Catedral's were.
Right. And
Some of them were, I mean, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say one of the things about the marriages that the argument that you make is that a lot of these marriages were between Creole women and Spanish men, primarily Spanish military men, correct?
Yes.
Why? So, what is this phenomenon about? Because it is, I think you point out that it is more particular to Cuba than to other parts of the Spanish Empire. Why are we seeing these I guess you can call them intermarriages, or why are we seeing these marriages, between
Happening.
Creole women and Spanish men?
Well, I mean, Cuba was the epicenter of a reform movement after 1763 that have come to be known as the Bourbon Reforms, because they were initiated by a king of the Bourbon family, Bourbon, if you will, in France. And these came about as a direct consequence of the fall of Havana in 1762. And we can talk more about the fall of Havana because it plays a bigger role in catastrophe than it did in social transformation. But essentially, the Bourbon reforms, they were multifaceted, but the facet that affects Cuba more than anything is the military reform, because the King of Spain vowed that Havana would never fall to a British siege ever and ever again. And so this entailed reforming the way the military structure existed in Cuba. And among those reforms were to send thousands and thousands of Spanish troops to Cuba to reinforce the existing garrisons. This became even so, this is what they began to do post 1763 with the arrival of Alejandro O'Reilly, or as the Cubans call him, O'Reilly. But it became even more important when Spain made the decision that it was going to enter what we know as the American Revolution, which surprisingly the Spaniards call war, because that's when they entered the war. But the War of American Revolution between the US colonies and Great Britain, France decided to enter the war in 1778 and Spain joined them. And that's when this massive, in anticipation of perhaps a military expedition, which took place, by the way, began to take place with the Bernardo de Galvez expedition against Pensacola. That's when Spain sent literally thousands of men into Cuba, at which point in time, there were at least 1/3 of the population of Havana was Spanish soldiers. Wow. Uncounted, mind you, but there were, of a population of 40,000 civilian inhabitants, at between 12 and 15,000 additional persons were Cuban soldiers.
Wow. And those men, the soldiers, were not counted in the censuses, right? I think I remember you and I talked about that. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind.
They were never counted.
Yeah. So
they were never counted in any census that was ever taken, which is why the information on the censuses is always flawed. You can never rely on a census, because a certain percent of the population, the Spanish military and the Spanish bureaucrats and their dependents. So if the Spanish military arrives with a Spanish wife and 4 Spanish children, they're never counted. because the crown already knows they're there. Why would they
Yeah.
double count people?
Yeah.
They're not interested in showing how great the population is. They take censuses for information to find out, I mean, how many people who are not the people they're paying for are there.
Right. Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Something I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little while ago about the church, the Catedral, the Parroquia Mayor, and in your book you do such a great job of describing these early churches and of what what they look like, and really the different kind of demographics that they cater to. So for instance, I forget which is Espiritu Santo saw less of these marriages because it was considered I guess a poorer church.
Espiritu Santo was a poorer
Yeah,
barrio, yes.
right.
And also Espiritu Santo, people who needed church attendance, in other words, who needed the services of a churchman, if you will, for whatever reason, because it was the closest to the populated area. The people from the southern parishes would walk into town and use the gates to be able to avail themselves of, for example, confession. If you needed confession and you lived in Jesus del Monte and that wasn't available, you used the gate that got you into the city, and the closest parish was Espiritu Santo.
Okay.
And well, plus it was the second founded parish in the city. Catedral was
Right.
first, and Espiritu Santo was second.
Right.
And
Catedral, yeah,
was first. It was
first.
the first.
Yeah.
And then Espiritu Santo was the second. And keep in mind too, and this is also not generally known, church services, meaning baptism, marriages, and last rites, are not free.
Right.
And so sometimes poor parishioners could not pay the fees requested by the more elite clergy in Catedral, and the priests in Espiritu Santo, or the priest in the hinterlands, if you will, didn't charge as much as the priests in Catedral, or could not elicit the same type of fees that the elite could pay in Catedral, because
Right.
Catedral was always known as the elite parish.
And it was, and maybe I'm skipping, but I think you mentioned it also in Social Transformation. Catedral, which was Parroquia Mayor, was destroyed,
Yes.
right, in a hurricane. Okay.
The church, the Parroquia Mayor was destroyed in a hurricane, and I believe it was 1739. And occurred in the hurricane of 1768. And so when that happened, the structure, the edifice, was no longer serviceable. And when Charles III threw the Jesuits out of Cuba, which wasn't that big a deal because there were really only 12 Jesuits there, certainly not the effect like Mexico or Peru, but they just took over the Jesuits building, which is what we know today as the Parroquia Mayor.
Oh, okay.
That was in good shape. So what we know with today is Catedral. If you go to that plaza and you see this what's on all the tourist brochures as Catedral, was originally belonged to the Jesuits, and then they were thrown out in 1767, and so the state, if you will, the state church, just simply took over the building and made it the Parroquia Mayor. The original Parroquia Mayor was on the Plaza de Armas. It was between the Palacio de Capitanes and La Ceiba, and on the south side.
Well, yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
It's okay. That's why you need me.
I mean, yeah, that's why you're here. That's why you're here.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is to see all these little towns, and for those of you who are from the eastern side of the island, I apologize. I feel like I'm always so Havana centric. And Dr. Johnson does write about Oriente, so they figures in. She talks about Holguín a lot, so they're all kind of in there. But sorry, I'm going to go back to Havana. The outlying area, I find that.
I've never had I've never had the opportunity to work in the eastern parishes either.
Yeah.
So I don't know them, and I don't know the topography
Yeah.
as well, although I visited them. But
Yeah.
anyway, sorry.
And you wrote about it. I mean,
Yes, I do.
it's
Yes.
interesting. That figures into the whole fall of Havana and how they're waiting for the reinforcements from Santiago, and they never get there because the men fall sick. But the outlying areas of Havana, these little towns, one of the things I got, nuggets that I got from reading this book again, was between 17, I think it's 65 to 1800, you have a whole bunch of new little towns that are formed, as opposed to the years prior to that. Why is there this growth in these towns? And I think you mentioned 10 parishes or something along those lines that sprout up in just a few short years. Was that something that the government or that the Spanish military was encouraging? Is it something you think that they needed to put populations there to work in agriculture? Why is it that we see, again, these towns like San Jose de las Lajas that we've worked in, Guines, these towns outside of Havana start to come about? Why do you think that is?
Yes, this is a multifold answer, because you have pressures on both sides. The goal of the Bourbon monarch, Charles III, who was Spain's best monarch, not just in terms of Spain, but also in terms of the colonies, although Mexico would disagree. Charles III's goal through his military advisors was to militarize the island, to make sure that a fall of Havana never happened again, or the fall of Cuba never happened again. And so the militarization is the demographic push that brings all these people into Cuba. But once you get all these people in Cuba, what are you going to do with them? The idea of a man signing on as a Spanish soldier in one of the impoverished sections of Spain, the idea is not to bring him back to Spain. The idea then is to, once he is done with his enlistment, if you will, and some of these guys turn out to be not really nice people, you don't want to bring him back to Spain. So the Spanish monarch, well, through his military advisors, reopens a practice that had begun with the Romans, and that is they give cashiered out soldiers a plot of land. They don't give them this plot of land in fee simple, but they give them in usufruct, it's called. That is the use of it, which they'll keep the use of it throughout their lives. And so they get the use of this piece of land. They've served 8 years. They cashier out. They've got to do something with them. They give them this piece of land. And as this process continues of these Spanish soldiers retiring in Cuba, getting these plots of land, that's when they begin to look for their wife. They're not going to bring somebody they don't know from Spain. This is when they begin to marry into the Creole female population. So imagine this process happening over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, and they keep granting these plots of land. Now, the new population need the services that only a government can provide. Among those things are services in the sense, again, birth, marriage, and death. And so this is why you see this increasing number of populations, poblaciones, if you will, begin to be formed around these new town nuclei. And in response, the church sends out or begin to construct churches. There's another facet to this too, is these cashiered out Spanish soldiers, they're never ever really cashiered out, because once they are officially retired as an active duty soldier, they automatically come into the local militia. No man is exempt from militia duty unless they are infirm, a merchant, or a student. They're the only adult males between the ages of 15 and 45 who are not liable for militia duty. The cashiered out soldiers are always liable for militia duty, and they remain in the militia within their local town, if you will, their pueblo. The Spanish crown sends an officer and a contingent of cavalry soldiers to live in this town to muster up the militia when is necessary. And so you have a new town that has multiple functions. It has a whole agricultural sector, which are these cashiered out soldiers. They're Creole brides. They now have a parish church who can take care of their needs because the people aren't going to die, they're going to be born, need to go to confession, and they need the religious services on Sunday. And then you have the Spanish military contingent that serves as a police force, along with a commanding officer who their title is Capitán del Partido. And they usually are also a cashiered out Spanish officer who's willing to stay and resettle, for example, in San Jose de las Lajas or or Candelaria or Pinar, for example. Pinar was founded in 1775 just for this reason. So that's it. That's how it happened.
There's so much there.
There's a multiple process going on here. To the Spanish crown's benefit, it's to the cashiered out soldiers' benefit, and it's also to the church's benefit. Everything is expanded, and in my opinion, it's successful. It's beneficial for the years between 1765 and the 1790s.
Right, and one of the things that you do in your book that really, again, stood out to me was these wonderful anecdotes from these little towns like Managua. These are towns that we have plans to digitize. Managua, San Jose de las Lajas, San Miguel del Padrón, Batabanó, Pejucal. Where did you find these sources? Where did you, because for those of you who haven't read the book, Dr. Johnson provides different testimonies of different residents there. In fact, there's one Juan Carrasco from Guanabacoa who may well be in my family, because I have Carrascos from Guanabacoa from the 1750s, and this guy's a Carrasco in this way. I have to look and see. He may be my ancestor. Where do you find these fascinating testimonies, these anecdotes from these people in these little towns, this micro data that, I mean, you obviously the macro data is the censuses, but this micro data, like these annual reports from these villages, how can researchers like us find those reports?
Well, there are essentially, there are multiple sources, but the ones that I relied on, the majority of my sources come from the reports of these capitanes del partido. And what these were, as I mentioned, as population centers grow up and as a contingent of cashiered out soldiers begin to live in an area, the crown sends this, usually a retired officer, out to this town to keep an eye on people. Officers must be literate. That is one of the qualifications to become an officer, is you must be able to read and write. And you must be able to read and write because your job is not only to keep order, but also to send reports back to Havana, to the Captain General, to tell him what's going on in your town, to make sure that you have the king's eyes and ears, you know, in these little towns like Batabanó, for example, because, you know, that's where the British are going to sneak up on you. They're going to sneak up from Jamaica. And so the Capitan of Batabanó or Managua on the south has to be able to read and write and warn the Captain General. But at the same time, they have to talk about the people in their town. They have to talk about the drunkards. They have to talk about, you know, priests propositioning women in the confessional and in Matanzas. And so all of this body of letters that begin as soon as these contingents are formed are sent back into Havana, and all of them are preserved in in Spain, in the Archivo de Indias in Seville, in the section which are called Papeles de Cuba, which is nothing but the correspondence from Spain, officially from around 1763 on, but they have earlier stuff that's been incorporated into there from other sections. And so if one wanted to find out, if one is interested in, we'll use Bano for an example, it's a good example. If one has relatives from Batabano, you can go into the Archivo de Indias in Seville and ask to see the correspondence of the with the Captain General from the Capitán del Partido of Batabano. Or you can look this up online and you can request that the correspondence from Batabano be digitized and sent to you. And so, and that's another option where you can go, and we can talk about that later. Another thing I thought about, and this is also, it's not necessary, it's not as rich as the Capitanes del Partido, but every town that had a priest also wrote back. And you also get the correspondence from the religious authorities. You get correspondence from the military contingent. So for example, the Capitán del Partido is an unofficial military person, but if you have a cavalry detachment stationed in, for example, there was one in Guines, I believe. There was what would call it's volante, which like a flying non-permanent cavalry unit, and they just go around all over the place. They too write back, and that correspondence is there. The itinerant priests will write back and talk about what's going on. So all of these types of documents are available in the Archivo de Indias. To a lesser degree, some of this exists in Cuba, in the INC, but it's not accessible like Spanish stuff is. So
yeah,
Cuba's archives are more closely guarded, that I must say, and more restricted in who they let in than the archives in Spain. And even then, sometimes the archives in Spain are wary of, I mean, they're very wary of treasure hunters, for example. So
yeah. Well, I can't wait to go and to find. I'll probably order them online.
I would encourage anybody to go to Seville. Over ordering a digitized CD online, but it's possible. Rich, do you want me to discuss Pares now, or?
I think so. Well, let me just go. I just want to have one more question for you on social transformation, because I think there's so many interesting characters and arguments and things in the book, but I want to touch just on Las Casas, and then we can talk about Pares, because he's such a fascinating figure, and you really break him down. You analyze him in a way that I think is great, and you talk about are we seeing Cuba start a rebellious streak during his tenure? He becomes unpopular. He starts out great. But do we see his rule kind of deteriorate with time? And we see, I know that there's an uprising or a planned uprising in San Jose de las Lajas, for instance, in 1790. Who is de las Casas, and why is he important to Cuba in the 1790s?
What historians do is we look at existing narratives and try to find and the flaws in the existing narratives. And the problem with Luis de las Casas is that he and Francisco de Arango have been lionized for multiple generations of historians. And one of the arguments I make is the problem with Cuban history is it's very insular. It only looks at Cuba and doesn't look at from an outside perspective. But the problem with Luis de las Casas is that he replaced an existing bureaucracy. And the reason why he replaced an existing bureaucracy is, unfortunately, the king died. The worst thing that could happen to Spain and to Cuba was that the king, who was my favorite, and I'm open about this, Charles III died. And his completely incompetent son took the throne. And he went in there to change all the good that had been done in Cuba and in other places. And to do so, he replaced the existing bureaucracy that was functioning with a different bureaucracy. And so Luis de las Casas was the representative of the new bureaucracy that was put in place in Cuba by Charles IV, the incompetent son. What did he replace? He replaced what I call the Galvez clan. And Jose de Galvez was the acknowledged leader of this clan of bureaucrats, military officers, and military officers, extremely, in my opinion, competent, capable of implementing the military reforms that were necessary. In Cuba, the Galvez clan was represented by Bernardo de Galvez, who was the head of the expedition against Pensacola. But what most people who study Cuban history don't understand is there was a mortal enmity, animosity between the people who were in the Galvez clan and who were military officers who benefited from the Galvez clan. Between them and the followers of the Las Casas and his brother-in-law, Alejandro O'Reilly, or O'Reilly. And that animosity began as early as 1765, but carried through when the Galvez clan was in ascendancy. They scored notable victories, not the least of which was pushing Spain into the American Revolution and winning, getting revenge of Havana. But when Charles III died, his son took over. He completely replaced the Galvez clan with the followers of the O'Reilly and Las Casas clan. And that's what caused the animosity. And that's what caused the enmity that lasted throughout the 19th century. So, and what I do is I look at how this, I don't see Las Casas's reforms as positive. I don't see as him trying to by changing the structure that was in place, attempting to change the structure that was in place. I don't see those as positive. That said, I do have to do one qualification in there, is that as in any money spending or dumping thousands and thousands of pesos into Cuba, sometime this has to come to an end. And by the 1790s, and overextending oneself in wars, it became obvious that some of the spending has to stop. And Las Casas was charged with stopping the military spending and finding a different way of earning money. It was at that point in time that the sugar planters stepped forward and said, we can do that. We can do the job for you. We can make money by selling our sugar. And oh my goodness, thank goodness Haiti was just destroyed. We can step into that gap and provide the revenue that you need to make up for the gap that you're spending in the military reform. So in all fairness, I mean, we have to be fair about this and say Las Casas was there to implement a very unpopular agenda, and that's to stop the massive transfer payments, the amount of money that's being pumped into Cuba. This money came, by the way, from Mexico and Peru, from the revenues, and Mexico and Peru were not happy about the money that was being spent in Cuba. And so they were very happy with the reforms that Las Casas was there to implement, which meant them not having to pay for Cuba. So,
right.
But I mean, the rivalry, we don't even begin to understand the depths of that animosity. That luckily a lot of this this comes from much of the documentation in Spain. It hasn't even been scratched. The surface hasn't been scratched. I introduced it,
Yeah.
but we don't even begin to know what it was.
Yeah. Yeah. So much we're not even aware of. And it's
No,
interesting
no.
as we find our documents, and I mean, I'm finding documents for my family from the 1790s. And now it makes me think, well, wow, they were dealing with this too. I mean, maybe they were
Sure.
ones that were unhappy with Las Casas and
Yeah. Or not. I mean,
we're not, exactly. We're not. So on that note of documents, how can researchers, like, how does that work with pares? How can the documents are capitanes? Who they would ask for the capitanes of a certain town?
The Spanish, the entire nation of Spain is linked together on an online network called Portal de Archivos Españoles, or for short, PARES, in English, PARES. And so if one were just to Google PARES, you would be taken to a link that brings you to this national network. And then from that national network, you would do a search of, you can do a generic search of a town, for example, to Guanabacoa, because you had been talking about Guanabacoa.
Yeah.
And so you would get all the hits in all of the archives all over Spain, where Guanabacoa is the topic of the document, or mentioned in the document. And so the majority of what I worked, well, yes, the majority of what I worked comes from the Archivo de Indias in Seville. It's one of these many archives. There's the Histórico Nacional in Madrid, there's Simancas, etc. Those archives provided secondary documentation, but the concentrated documents from 1760s through the 18 teens and 20s, and later, come from the Archivo de Indias. And you would go into the section in the Archive of the Indies called Papeles de Cuba, or for short, Cuba, and look up the documentation, and you would take that citation and contact the Archive of the Indies directly and ask for that documentation to be duplicated, digitized, and they would go in and scan it. And so it's not that costly, but it's certainly less costly than a trip to Spain.
Yeah.
And then they would send it to you. A word of warning: they are very, very backed up.
Yeah.
Through no fault of their own. I mean, they were backed up 2 years ago before COVID. I can't imagine how long it takes now.
So a trip to Spain might be more efficient.
Well, it would
and more fun, right?
It would be more fun and more efficient. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not up to date on, the visiting hours, or if they're even allowing visiting. So,
Yeah. Is everybody writing that down? How to do this? Yeah. I mean, we can go over it again on our own.
It's recording.
It's recording. I wrote it down on my phone. Papeles de Cuba.
Well, it's papeles. The primary body of information, the quickest way to get to personal stories is via this concentrated correspondence from the Capitan in your pueblo. And I concentrate on the 18th century, where the documentation is less numerous. But by the 19th century, these guys are writing virtually every day. I mean, you'll get voluminous correspondence because they're having to report. And there's a lot going on. I mean, there are lots of rebellions, and I mean, especially Matanzas. One guy, the Gaspar Rodriguez rebellion, these guys, they're trying to chase Gaspar Rodriguez down, and they're writing every day. He's kind of like, he's kind of like a ghost. He's seen here and seen there, and they're writing about, the number of horses, and they're writing about the people who are complicit, and they're writing about why we can't do this because the roads are bad. And so by the 1820s, there's just a wealth of documentation, more than anybody can. I mean, if you're looking for your ancestors, that's where to go. So, and you can go through, I mean, if you're a native speaker of Spanish, you can go through this one legajo, which is this bundle of documents. I call them, for my students, I used to call them equivalent to 3 Miami phone books. And you can go through that in pretty much in a day quickly. So, because you don't have to read the whole thing. You just, see who you're looking for and move on.
Right. I want to talk about, because Dr. Johnson, we have to let her go, unfortunately, by 3:30. So I want to get to the hurricane,
Okay.
which is just fascinating. But I want to also allow some time for questions. So from you,
wow, it's already 3 o'clock.
I know. 1750s, you talk about as that being kind of the beginning of bad weather, the El Nino, La Nina cycle, the years 1759 to 61. There's like a major hurricane that hits Cuba every year. Can you tell us what's going on with weather in the Caribbean and Cuba at this time, and how does it affect Cubans?
Yes. Well, I am a girl. My dad came to Miami in the 1930s. And so hurricanes have always been a very big part of my life, of my consciousness, if you will, more so than, say, somebody who would come from up north. And so I also was blessed to be able to work with one of the pioneer researchers of El Nino and La Nina when I was a graduate student. And so I asked him back when I was a graduate student, what effect El Nino has on the Caribbean. And through our conversations, we recognized that weather plays an extremely important part in determining what people do. And especially so in what we call pre-industrial society, which are, you can call the phone and say, look, a hurricane's coming, or even before a telegraph can tell you, look, a hurricane's coming. And so I began to look at the effect of hurricanes. And then I became influenced because the state of the discipline was evolving there into the issue of climate change and weather cycles, and why a weather cycle is important. And so, according to the climatologist, there are periods of warmth and cold throughout the world. I mean, these are things that humans affect, but really don't affect. And it's been happening as long as the Earth has existed as a planet. And we know that, for example, in the historic period, and we'll define the historic period as sometime after the Roman Empire, say 500 present era onward, we know that Earth is in a warmer period from about 800 to about 1300. And then in 1400, the climate got very, very cold. This colder period is called the Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age, within the Little Ice Age, there's even colder periods and warmer periods. A colder period occurred from about 1650 to about 1715. And then it began to get warmer, dramatically warmer, beginning, as Rich mentioned, in about 1750 and lasting through 1800. I'm going to try. I have graphs here. Okay, Brian, do you think we can try to pull up the PowerPoint and see what happens? Brian?
Yes. So
can I try to pull up the PowerPoint and show the climate theme?
Let's try it. So
okay, let's go to new share. And where is my, okay, there's my PowerPoint. All right. Okay, share. I'm sharing. Can you see that?
yes.
Okay, all right. Let me hit current slide and you'll get the full. Okay. Now you can see the climate, the temperature change, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is, here is what we call the medieval climate anomaly, the medieval warm period, when the Vikings were when they were, could go to Greenland and it wasn't freezing like it is now. This is the beginning around 1200 of the crash. And the beginning, and so you have 200 years of progressively colder temperatures until you reach here with the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1450 and lasting until about 1800. But let me move this forward, there's a medieval warm period. And then we have this little ice age, bad for the Vikings because they had to leave Greenland, but good for Spain. Why for Spain? That's the period of Spanish expansion. But let me go here. This is the period we're talking about. Please note that within the little ice age, you have this period of warmer temperatures. Can everybody see that? You can see my mouse and my little cursor, right? The arrow. And in here, this period of warmer temperatures is what we're talking about. What does this, let me give you an example of a family who's living someplace and they've lived for 120 years, which are at least 5 generations of family getting used to a climate circumstance of colder and drier weather. And all of a sudden they're living beside a lake, and all of a sudden they're hit with a climate cycle that it's getting progressively warmer, the lake is rising. What are they going to do? These are human decisions that have to be made. What does this translate to? It translates to, and this comes directly from NOAA, this chart, this is the time period we're talking about. So here you have 200 and something years in which there are not that many hurricanes in the Caribbean. And then all of a sudden, bam, these are the number of recorded hurricanes that we know about. But even more important, please note these light charts, or these hollow charts, if you will. These are the number of unverifiable hurricanes from NOAA, from the archives that they can guess that happen, which are even greater than any other period in history. And so these are periods that NOAA says there were more hurricanes. And again, if drought, I'm going to go beyond the drought. But okay, this is the El Nino phenomenon that we're talking about that is linked to the El Nino process. The warm episodes, the El Nino means drier in the Caribbean, but then you get, does the El Nino affect hurricane? And this is a quote directly from NOAA, the moderate to strong El Nino substantial reduction in cyclone, meaning hurricane numbers. But more importantly, this is La Nina. La Nina means wet and cool. And again, directly from NOAA, during the non-Nino, the Nina, hurricane season, expect a small increase in the number of hurricanes and an increase in their intensity. And so that's what I wanted to point out, that we can go back to this right here, to the present slide. We can go back to the current slide and we can look at what was happening in the entire Caribbean, but specifically our interest is Cuba, and say there is clearly a larger number of hurricanes. People are experiencing worse and worse, increasingly worse weather. So what does this mean in terms of practicality? Okay, I'm going to come out of this, and you want to switch back to the if you want to switch back to me, or you can leave. It doesn't matter. You can leave. I don't care. You can leave this on. It's up to you.
Brian, can we switch back to Dr. Johnson?
So anyway, so what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of human reaction? And you have to contextualize this within the arrival of thousands and thousands of new people in Cuba. The idea, okay, now you're asking me to start my video. We'll try to start my video. See if
we'll try that again.
Nope, doesn't work. Doesn't work in our attempt, and doesn't work now. Okay. In a context, the idea of bringing all of these new military officers and new military soldiers to Cuba was that once they're done, we're going to cashier them out. We're going to put them in the countryside, and they're going to begin growing their own food. And that would have been fine if Mother Nature had cooperated, but Mother Nature did not cooperate. And Mother Nature cursed Cuba, if you will, with sequential bad weather beginning in the 1750s and going on and on and on and on and on until finally, if the royal plan is going to work, they had to get food from someplace.
Yeah.
They tried to get food from Mexico, but unfortunately, when you have an El Nino and La Nina, Nino is a worldwide phenomenon and it affects everywhere. And what it affected was it destroyed the wheat crop in Mexico. So Mexico could not provide wheat for Cuba. And so therefore the Spanish crown, after a period of 12 years of trying and trying and trying, finally had to break down and contact the great breadbasket of the world, which was North America. And in particular, the greatest producer of flour in the world was the Port of Philadelphia. And so the Spanish officials contacted the great figures in US history, in American colonial history, most importantly, Robert Morris, who was known as the treasurer of the revolution, who went into partnership with the representative from Cuba to send flour to Cuba to feed the Cuban soldiers. I make the argument that if it were not for this happening, the American Revolution would not have been successful. I make this argument, in other words, the patriots in Philadelphia would not have had the alternate market that they needed to issue their Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Why do I make this argument? Because as early as May, that is 3 months before the Declaration of Independence, the Spanish representative was en route to Philadelphia to reassure the patriots that Spain would buy their flour. And we have that documented. I mean, obviously you have to for an academic book, but 3 months in May, the guy was on his way to buy flour from Philadelphia. And so without that guaranteed market from the Spanish colonies, done of course by Charles III and his ministers, among them Jose de Galvez and his council of advisors, to rescue the patriots and provide this alternate market, so they could tell Great Britain that they no longer that the restrictive economic acts that Great Britain had placed upon it were irrelevant, that they had an alternate market. And so that's the result. However, the only reason this would have happened was Spain was forced into doing this. The reason Spain was forced into doing it was because of the climatological conditions that you saw in that chart that made domestic production of the necessary foodstuffs impossible. Because with 10 years of bad weather, increasingly bad weather, the crisis year was 1772, increasingly bad weather makes any of these schemes, if you will, not viable. And food has to come from somewhere. Food is the most important commodity.
Yeah, I didn't realize, I mean, food shortages, how prevalent they were in Cuba during this time, and all the arguments that are
right
being made to try to open up Cuba to freer trade, and then on the other hand, to stop smuggling. Something else that is interesting is the connection between this bad weather, like hurricanes and floods, to disease.
Yeah.
And you know, for those of us who look at the death records from these parishes, and a lot of them list what they died of, and they list the actual disease. A lot of those diseases aren't necessarily around anymore. You talk about one called calenturas teresiana.
Okay.
Yes.
No, calenturas mean fevers.
It's fever, but it's not yellow fever, right?
No,
because yellow fever is later. Yeah.
No, well, it's not later. It's just not calenturas. A yellow fever is oh my goodness, the vómito negro. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I lost my Spanish there for a minute. Vómito negro, because in the latter stages of yellow fever, hemorrhaging begins in the digestive tract, and people begin to cough up blood. But the calenturas are different. And calenturas, no, malaria that's not malaria. It's not malaria, Lourdes. No,
it's typhoid.
Malaria is something else.
I think it's typhoid. Typhoid fever, right?
No. And the reason why she said, the reason why this is not malaria is because in the instances I found is the people have, I think it's dengue.
Oh, okay.
For to tell Lourdes, but because okay, the correspondence, and again, when I mentioned why this correspondence is hard to find, this correspondence does not exist in Spain. This correspondence only exists in the Archivo Nacional de Cuba. And my student and I were the first ones to break the seal on these package of documents from Santiago in 2003. And we're opening them up and they're talking all about this fever. And the reason why we know it's not malaria is because as they're reporting all these sick people, they're saying the medicine the doctors are giving us doesn't work. We're not getting any better. We can't figure out what's wrong with us. And that medicine would have been quinine, because they knew about quinine, and quinine was the standard, or cinchona bark. They would have used a derivative of the cinchona bark. I'm trying to think of the name of the Puerto Rican physician historian who helped me with this, but he's very famous, and I'm sure I'll remember his name. That we're sitting in the archive in Spain, and I'm reading about this, and he's saying, no, it's definitely not malaria, because it says that, the quinine doesn't work. And so the interesting thing about this is that because they were using what they would consider traditional medicine, i.e. quinine, to attack a disease that wasn't responding to it, what he and I came up with is we think it was dengue. It was probably the earliest manifestation or recorded that we can find of dengue. And why? Because it's mosquito borne, and it's mosquito borne because of the continuous rains that were happening in Santiago beginning in the 1750s, but especially during the time of the siege of Havana. And the siege of the debilitated Spanish troops during the siege of Havana meant they couldn't reinforce. They tried, they sent an expedition from Santiago, and they made it as far as present day Cienfuegos. It was called Jagua at the time.
Yeah.
And they made it that far, and they were so sick they had to turn back. And dengue is particularly bad because it's called breakbone fever. It's particularly bad because of the headaches that go along with it. And
would you say that
I'm sorry?
Would you say then that would be a main fact that played a main role in the loss of Havana?
I would, absolutely. We've never ever looked at, we look all the time at the Great British Victory. We've never ever looked at the inability of the Spanish troops to defend against, because the reinforcement expedition couldn't make it. They were stopped at Cienfuegos. Absolutely. We know that for a fact from the correspondence. But the thing of it is what stopped them, and that's what I think is one of the sort of kind of the disappointing things about historians not taking up on climate and catastrophe, is this explains. There was another expedition coming from Matanzas that didn't make it, that Prado had already capitulated. And we have to keep in mind.
Had he waited a day, right? Had he waited a day or two?
A day, exactly. They were a day away. Exactly. Yeah. And so, and I remember the name of the historian. His name is Jose Rigaud, R-A-G-A-U-D, I believe, who was such a great help to me in, in piecing out what this mystery disease could have been. But it definitely was not malaria. We would have known. Malaria responded to quinine, and this did not. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I have time for one more of my questions, because I want to open it up. But the hurricane of 1768, the Santa Teresa, you describe it as that this is something that a hurricane that basically shifted the response of the monarchy. The monarchy started to be more proactive in providing disaster relief. But what impact did this hurricane have on Cuba? And specifically, you mentioned the outlying areas and villages outside of Havana, like Guanabacoa. Did it devastate the
Yes.
these towns? Yeah.
This was the real first test case. I mean, Santa Teresa is important in that it's the first major, and this was a major hurricane. It devastated a 50-mile wide radius from just a little bit west of Matanzas all the way to the west of Havana. And so it's the first test case, and it combines with this new impetus to send information. So there's so much information about what's coming in from these outlying towns, what they're talking about. You can get an idea of the measures to stop looting, the measures to stop price gouging. They're saying, no, don't let price gouging. If this is the price before, don't let them charge if they have some kind of provision. The demand, the towns that were not that affected, everybody's told to go out and collect the palm leaves that, everybody that knows Cuba calls guano, but everybody else doesn't know any better. And so they're told to go out and collect the palm leaves, put them on mule carts, and send them to Havana. So it is the first, it's a very bad hurricane, but it's the first real test case. And it's the hurricane, getting back to your earlier question, that does in finally the old parish church. Any hope that they would ever be able to hold services again in the parish church is gone with the hurricane of 1768. But it's the first eye opener of a major hurricane hitting the centers of government power, which was Havana, and saying, we really need to rethink where we're going to get food from, because again, the whole hinterland is affected. Every town from just slightly west of Matanzas all the way out into Pinar are affected.
Wow.
So
looting is not something that we
shoot on sight.
And it's not unique to the
directive.
20th and 21st century.
No.
It's happening back then.
No, that's the directive.
I think we're gonna try to get in some questions.
Okay.
Brian, do you have any questions or see anybody that has asked them? Because I can't see the chat. Oh, yeah.
We do have a few questions. So
you want to ask?
First of all, when you said Noah, I thought you're talking about the biblical Noah, and I was impressed that you could go back that far. So
even he was writing. Oceanography, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration.
Yeah, then I saw it on your slide. Yeah.
Right.
Which,
by the way, for those who don't know, their hurricane center is on FIU's campus.
Oh, wow. Well,
it is. And in fact, when Katrina, people don't know that Katrina, that devastated New Orleans, actually hit Florida first. And it came in West Palm Beach, headed south, and passed directly over the NOAA office in FIU. So, and I need to say this really quickly, that, I'm retired from FIU, but I'm still very loyal. And especially my dean, John Stack, has always been a great supporter. So just to get it out there that I was, blessed to have been a professor at FIU for 25 years. So.
We have a question from Lourdes about capitanes de partido. Were they always ex-military?
Yes.
Okay.
I've never found one that was not. There may have been later, but I've always, because they have to perform a military function.
And then what role did the military that was relocated from St. Augustine to Cuba play in the fortification of Havana?
They were extremely important, because there was always a question of how disloyal the defenders of Havana were. And so the question did not extend to St. Augustine, because they didn't play any part. So 100% you could rely on the evacuated St. Augustine garrison that they would be loyal, because there's no question about their loyalty, because they didn't take part in Havana. And that also, by the way, extends to Pensacola. One of the men who became extremely important, not just in Cuba, but also later in St. Augustine, Vicente de Céspedes, was in Pensacola at the time of the fall of Havana. Awesome. So that, and they were segued almost immediately into the command structure.
Here's the book. I don't know.
Yes.
You're welcome, Lourdes. Glad to hear from you.
Yeah.
Here's the book. It's amazing. It's an amazing read. It's fun to read. People are asking about it. We'll post more information about how to find the book.
Okay.
What's
That's
good-
from University of Florida Press.
Yeah, so you
Yeah,
can,
and the other one's from UNC.
yeah, you can go to University of Florida Press and get Social Transformation for a Reasonable Price. And then the other one, the Climate and Catastrophe, is UNC Press, so University of North Carolina Press. Also, you can find them on Amazon, but sometimes Amazon price gouges, so you don't want to do that.
Check out. There's another secondary bookseller called Alibris, but also, I mean, I probably. Sometimes these books are assigned for classes. They're still assigned in classes on Cuba. And at the end of the semester, you can sometimes find students selling them really cheaply.
Brian, we're getting some Teresa and Addis.
Just go ahead.
I can't see the book. Actually, put the book closer to you, because if you put it, there you go.
That's social transformation.
Social transformation. Teresa was saying that, can we get the book? That was out of print. I don't know if, Teresa, you're referring to this one or the other one.
The hard copy's out of print.
The hard copy's out of print. Yeah. So the paperback.
The soft copy's available on demand, but it's always available, which should always be available from the secondary sellers, because it's assigned as a classroom text.
Right.
I mean, these were intended for, academic classes. So that's why I suggest at the end of semester, lots of times, kids who have to.
Kids want to unload.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Teresa was saying she got 98 pages from the AGI, so that's great.
Good.
It works. Thank you to everyone who's watching too. Thank you for your continued support. I recognize a lot of the names. Brian, do you see any other questions for Dr. Johnson?
Yes. So those 4,400 marriage records, have you posted that anywhere, published it, or?
I gave them to Miami Gen. Oh, excuse me. Kyoga, no. Sorry, my German Shepherd is heading out my door.
Oh.
After a cat. 1 second, let me.
Sure.
We saw that cat earlier.
Miami, I gave all of this information to Miami Gen Club in 2007. They have copies of my notebook. No, you can't. You can publish anything from my notes. Yes, please do. And make it available to anybody who wants it, as long as it's my notes. The film we can't publish because it's proprietary to the AGI, but I've seen that you have, sorry, I'm very concerned because my dog just went out the door. I've seen that you have started to database the information from the film. And so, of course, that's yours if you're doing the work and reading the film. But also, we just digitized your notes. Great. Just for everybody's information, I am working with the University of Florida as soon as this COVID mess is over, that all of my film is going to be given to the University of Florida in Gainesville, along with all of my notes. And so you'll be able to go into the reading room at the university and work with everything that I have. And so all everything that I collected over my 40-year career, that's what academics are supposed to do, is to give it and pass it on. And so I will make it, it will be available, and to anybody who wants it. But yes, anything that I gave to Miami Gen Club, that having the conversation with Lourdes, I intended it to be used to everybody's benefit, of course. So, and there, you have to go through I don't have the database of that. Again, we did this, I think it was 2007. I think we spent like 5 or 6 weekends, just, people like Lourdes and Teresa. We went into FIU, into the history department, and good, and just sat and did the work to make it available. So I'm happy to share it. Absolutely.
It's so helpful because some of that information is quickly disappearing in the parishes. So
Yeah.
Rich and I have this urgency to get there, to get this done, rapid. So
Right.
Yes.
And let me also mention, I know it's not a goal, it's not your goal, but I do want to mention my friend Jane Lander's project on ecclesiastical sources for slave societies.
Of course. Yeah.
I concentrated on the parish records of Españoles or white people. Jane, for almost all of her career, has looked at the militia of color, and she too has digitized parish records all over the world. And so both of these sources can and should be used by genealogists, because there's a lot of crossover, and people but not just that. There are census lists. I mean, there's a massive census taken of Oriente that I think the film should be with the Miami Gen Club. If not, it'll go with it'll go to UF. But it's like a 64-page census of every living soul in Santiago de Cuba in 1766. Ditto, and this is, I don't know, I was taking these because the goal of my philosophy about doing research is, if it's available and you can take an image, take it. You never know when it will be useful to you or useful to somebody else. And so I have censuses upon censuses, and I didn't even begin to scratch the surface of what's available in the AGI. We will be, and then let me also mention a catalog done by Cesar Garcia del Pino and his wife, Alicia Mayes. He is, in my opinion, the grandfather, the godfather of Cuban colonial history. Completely unheralded. His contribution has been overlooked incredibly. Nobody knows him outside of Cuba and Spain. And nobody knew, unfortunately, he just passed away last year. Nobody knew of his contribution, but he spent more years in the Archivo de Indias than any living historian of Cuba. And he published a guide. And I think the name of that guide is Catálogo Parcial de los Fondos en la Sección 12 de Cuba. And I'll find it. It's in my books. But what this is, it's a calendar. He went through every legajo and listed what's in that legajo. And, after years, he only made it to maybe comprehensively to about 1780. And you have another 1780 to 1865, you have another 80 years, at least. He and his wife were only able to do 25 years. And so look at that as a beginning.
Yeah.
And then also in Pares. His catalogo is a tangible, it's a book. But there should be copies at FIU, and the legajos are not always, that's true. Yes. They're not, Lourdes, it's called the GIGO model. Because you're always dependent on the person who's reading that. It's called the GIGO, is the garbage in, garbage out. That your work is only as good as the person putting this information in. Which is why you have to be careful relying on censuses. They only count civilians. They don't count bureaucrats. And it's like going to Washington, D.C. and saying, we're not going to count anybody who works for the government in Washington, D.C. because we already know they're here and we're paying them. How many people in Washington, D.C. don't work for the government? How many people in Gainesville, for example, are not affiliated with the university?
Yeah. Very few.
Very few, exactly. And so, that's why you have to view these censuses with a real degree of skepticism, simply because, it's not their fault. They were told not to count the bureaucrats.
Yeah.
And they weren't creating these censuses for us 150 years later.
We have Martha mentions that the links to the Vanderbilt files are on cubagenclub.org. And so
Great,
they
good.
are there. And then Latasha asks if Dr. Johnson mentioned Jane Farinas. No, Dr. Johnson mentioned Jane Landers. Jane Landers heads the project at Vanderbilt University on the Slave Society Digital
Right.
Archive.
And it's not just Cuba, it's she and a woman in Brazil began the project to start with Cuba and Brazil when they branched
Right.
out.
And they have Colombia. Yeah, they have other.
Oh, they're doing Colombia now, yes.
Yeah.
A former student of mine databased the entries, and he gave it to Jane. His name is Miguel Ramos, and so he gave it to Jane, and I don't, because he was interested in his ancestors, and so I don't know what happened to it, but that might already be up, meaning that it's text searchable. In other words, you can put in your ancestor's name, and if it happens to be in Jane's database, she'll find it. So. But yeah, the sources are available, and Pares is searchable. Not just Pares and not just Cesar Garcia del Pinos, but also there's another series of books called Documentos Inéditos, and they're a calendar of in this case they're doing the section Audiencia de Santo Domingo, and they list, they're not comprehensive, but the point is that they have indices or indexes in the back. And if you're looking for a particular ancestor who's mentioned in the document, you go and find them in the indexes. We did not mention, and I need to mention, the alternate, because we're focusing on Papeles de Cuba, because that's where the correspondence comes from that I used. But
Right.
the Audiencia de Santo Domingo are, by definition, an audiencia record is a judicial record. And lots of times things that don't, the sort of the things at the local level, there's no reason for anybody in say, Pembroke Pines to take a case to the Supreme Court or to the federal district court. The audiencia records are generally things that are too important for local levels. And that's also in Spain. And that's what this Documentos Inéditos series is about. And they're all the audiencias, of which there were 12. Cuba comprises 2
And Cuba was part of the jurisdiction of Audiencia de Santo Domingo. I think.
Local
I think we're having some technical
audio.
Yeah. Dr. Johnson?
I think we need a part 2 with her because we just got started.
We just barely scratched the surface. Is Dr. Johnson still on?
She's still there, but maybe we went past our 3:30 deadline a little.
I hear you, but you're kind of in and out.
Okay. Well, maybe
Now-
I ought to say thank you, and I
You're back.
appreciate it.
Yes.
And collect the questions and invite me to do this.
I missed the last part. Did you hear it, Brian?
I think she said write down the question.
Back.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay. Okay.
Questions and take me back. Take 6 months, then we'll talk.
Perfect.
Perfect.
We'll do a 2022 edition.
Yeah. Well, I know we have to let you go. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We definitely need a part two. You're just a wealth of information.
We'll do a part two. I think you can probably hear me again now, right? Okay.
Yes,
So,
you're
no, it was
perfect.
going back and forth, and that's what I said. Get feedback from your audience. Thank you, audience, for being here and listening. I'm happy to work with everybody, and we'll do this again. We'll meet in 6 months.
Yes, yes.
Or a year or something.
6 months.
Maybe I'll have progress on the sequel to Social Transformation by then.
Oh, I'm hoping for that. Yes, Dr. Johnson's wanting to work on a sequel to Social Transformation, which if you read it, it kind of ends in around 1808, which is a critical time period. It's when Napoleon comes and all of the other Spanish American colonies start to break away, and then Cuba doesn't. So why isn't Cuba successful in breaking away? So definitely looking forward to that. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, again for talking to us.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you. Thank Brian. Thank your audience. My email is johnsons@FIU.edu. And I will be honest, I'm retired, so I don't keep up with email as often as I should. But why don't you go ahead and contact Brian or Rich and complain to them, and then they can get in touch with me and we'll do this again, okay?
Okay, and congratulations on the 20th anniversary of Social Transformation.
And 10th of Climate and Catastrophe.
And the 10th anniversary of Climate and Catastrophes. Thank you so much.
Okay, again, it's my pleasure, guys, and we'll be talking soon.
Okay, great.
And maybe my Zoom will work then.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Brian, we'll stay on.
Okay.
I guess.
All right,
Yes.
let's see. I need to click leave. Got it.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Could we try to answer a few questions that maybe Lourdes could help?
So
someone asked for the definition of a Creole woman. I think I know, but I would rather let someone else answer that question.
Oh, a Creole woman. Oh, yeah. So definition of that. A Creole woman is a Creole was simply somebody who was born in the Americas of European parentage. So if your parents were from Spain, but you were born in, say, Cuba, you were a Creole. So a Creole woman was a woman who was born in Cuba, but was of Spanish, could be parents or grandparents. So they were essentially, they were white. And this phenomenon of Creole women marrying Spanish men was very common in the 1700s for different reasons. It was in the interest of the Creole woman to marry the Spanish man because there was limpieza de sangre, so you were guaranteed somebody who was pure, and it was often in the advantage of the Spanish man to marry a Creole woman because they would marry a Creole woman who was from a prominent family and usually came with a large dowry. So kind of they would both benefit from that union. Marriages were strategic sometimes. Do we have any other questions? Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Teresa, Mayrelis, Latasha, Marta, Avis, and we had a question from, thank you, Rachel. We had a question from Isabel. No, was it Isabel? Yes. How can I find information on my great-grandmother and sister who left Cuba in 1878? Last name Izaguirre Milanes. Left Cuba. Well, you would have to know. It depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for their birth record, you would find their birth record in the town that they were born. And of course, it depends where they left to. So if they left to the US, there's probably a good record existing of that. We have another question. Is there a list from Denise? Is there a list on where parishioners' information was housed, if not in their main parish? For example, my cousins who were baptized in Jesus del Monte, their records are housed in a church in Santiago de las Vegas because the church in Jesus del Monte didn't have ink and paper at that time. So that's a great question. I think a lot of times we will see that for a variety of reasons. I know a lot. There were people that lived in Guines who were baptized in San Jose de las Lajas, or maybe they were baptized in Managua. We've seen it, and you know, it could be something like the fact that there wasn't ink and paper in that parish, or it could be that they maybe wanted, it was more advantageous for them to be baptized in a certain area. So.
Rich, do you know the email that Sherry, Dr. Johnson had mentioned at the end?
Her email, yes. It's Johnson S for Sherry. So Johnson S at FIU.edu. So FIU.edu.
And Rich, you'd recommend them getting the book?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a wealth of information. And one of the things that struck me again was reading through it. It was like, how did she find all of these stories? And then to look at the sources and where she found them, the legajos, where they came from. So I'm definitely pumped to do my own research in a lot of these little towns.
St. Augustine, thank you. What's interesting is, you know, she published that map of all those new little towns that popped up. So sometimes when we're researching our ancestors, the baptismal record's not going to match what you think it's, you know, you can't force your ancestor into a place that it didn't happen. So you have to be a little creative and look, you know, nearby or a neighboring parish, or
right.
Don't give up. Is that there's hope. You gotta keep.
I found my great grandmother's death record in a nearby town that I would not have thought to look in. She was, I always thought she was from Guines, yet somehow she ended up, her burial record was in San Jose de las Lajas. There's no way I would have been able to imagine that. I mean, it took me like kind of 10 years to figure that out and to find that record. Also, you mentioned St. Augustine, and we didn't get a chance to talk to Dr. Johnson about it, but she writes extensively about St. Augustine and the Agostinos, or the Floridianos settling in Cuba in the 1760s, and how private land was used, or rather was donated, to establish this town for the Spanish that were fleeing St. Augustine. And one of the reasons that the person did that, I think his name was, I can't remember, it was Conde de Jerónimos something. And one of the reasons he did that was because he needed labor, right? So he donated this land, and I forget how many of them came, but the Floridianos settled in what I think they called it Nuevo San Agustín de Florida, or the Nueva Florida, a town that became known later as Ceiba Mocha. And then interestingly enough, when St. Augustine, so that was, St. Augustine becomes English in 1763, but then in 1783, after Spain is victorious over Great Britain, they get Florida back. And so at that point, we have Alejandro O'Reilly in Cuba, who wants to resettle these Floridianos in back to Florida. And at that point, a lot of them are not willing to do so. So lots of connections between Florida and Cuba.
I tried posting that map on the chat in Facebook, but it wouldn't let me. So We'll try and get those links back up for the book.
Yeah, Seville. Yes, I see some of our supporters like Teresa wants to go to Seville. Is great. I would love to go. I think I might go actually in the next few months, because I'm really interested in that archive. There must be a treasure trove of information on the little towns that we encounter in the documents.
Lourdes, have you been to Seville? No. Oh, we should all go. That would be an awesome trip.
Field trip.
AGI that the doctor mentioned. What is that?
AGI is the Archivo General de Indias, and
Okay.
that's in Seville. That's the name of the archive in
That's
Seville.
perfect.
And that's what she was mentioning, contains a lot of the correspondence from these towns.
Perfect. Does anyone remember the name of the official that was on his way to Philadelphia for the food deal? That story was kind of quick. Someone asked a question about that.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the official.
Okay.
Um,
I'll see if there's any other final questions.
But Bartolomé de Morales, who's one of the Spanish soldiers that arrives in Cuba during this time, and that's the one that Dr. Johnson chronicles his journey into Cuba. He ends up also serving in Florida, and he is the grandfather of Felix Varela. Felix Varela was a Cuban intellectual in the 19th century, who's really one of the first to call for independence from Spain. So it's interesting because his grandfather, and I believe his father also, were Spanish.
That's all the questions I saw in there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for watching us and for continuing to support us. We're looking forward to getting back into our digitization mode very soon. Definitely by January. I will be there probably early to mid-January. So looking forward to that. Any other questions?
Thank you, Lourdes. Thanks everyone. Thanks us for the presentation, and she's going to see Sherry again. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you everyone. So we hope you learned something. I always learn something new. So, and it's great to be connected to the other researchers.
Oh, it would be great if you suggestions. I mean, we have a lot of ideas, but suggestions for future topics that we can cover, and then perhaps I can even find somebody, an expert on that topic to come and speak with us. So if you have any topics that you'd be interested in us covering, you can put it in either in the chat or as a Facebook comment. So, and we will definitely try to cover that topic.
I'm putting her email in the chat so what people can get that. Thank you, Teresa. She says great presentation.
Denise is asking if there's any information about the Varela surname, and I don't know offhand. I'm sure there is. I don't think Felix Varela. I believe Felix Varela was a priest, or he becomes a priest, and he did. I don't think he left any direct descendants, but I'm sure there must be information on Varela, given that it's such a big name in Cuba. He was a real seminal figure in the 19th century. I mean, he was, he started a newspaper, but he had to start it in Philadelphia because he could not publish it. And he actually lived in Philadelphia for a long time. And his new newspaper was the first to openly call for independence from Spain. And this is early, this is maybe 1820s, 1830s. kind of around the time when all of the other Spanish American colonies were fighting for independence, he was the first one to actually say it out loud in that way, to actually call for independence, not autonomy, not, we need more rights kind of thing, but to actually call for independence. And of course, that was published in Philadelphia. The Spanish crown would not allow him to publish that in Cuba. Teresa says that there is a Varela organization here that may have that. So,
according to this book that I always refer to, Varelas were in La Habana area in about the 1600s. So,
okay, there you go.
There should be a lot of information. So,
thank you, more Ashley. Thank you, Diana, Nicolas. And I think that's it. So again, we look forward to presenting something, and we'll have someone else, another scholar, talk about that topic. Maybe something on the church, something on the Catholic Church and the way they handled, and put records together. I don't know. So again, any topics that you have, any suggestions, please let us know, and we look forward to seeing you guys again soon.
thank you, everybody. We'll see you in November.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.